Alright, first thing we're going to show is how to remove a brake caliper and basically explain how it goes onto the fork. So what we want to do is take the brake post bolts off. There you go, it's magically gone. Okay, so we're going to explain how to do brake maintenance from the start by putting on brake calipers and then routing cables, etc. Okay, so you have your brake caliper. What you want to do is find the little nub on the back of the caliper arm that will slide onto the brake post boss and fit into one of those three holes. We always set our brakes to the center. So simply just slide that piece on. It's hard to see in the video, but it is in there, and now what you want to do is just the same thing for the other side. Make sure that you're putting it in the corresponding center bolt. This should go on pretty easily. Next thing you want to do is just add the brake post bolts and tighten them down as well as you can. Okay, so we're going to slide the brake cable into the brake lever. We use what is called a ball end brake cable rather than a bullet end. Simply looks like a ball rather than a bullet. And so what you want to do is line up the slit going across the brake lever with a slit that goes through the barrel adjuster and the locking nut, and slide in the ball end into the lever, and then just simply route the cable through the lever and slide the cable housing up into the stop on the barrel adjuster. Once you have your cable pulled through your brake cable housing, you want to slide on the noodle. Make sure that fully stops against the cable housing. Then put on the little rubber grommet that will keep any dirt from getting inside the brake noodle. It's important because the noodle is lubricated and any dirt that gets in there will affect the function of the brake. So next, slide the noodle onto the right drive side caliper arm into the little slot at the top of the arm, like so. You just slide the little grommet down over that, and then feed your cable through the pinching bolt on the left or non-drive side caliper arm. This cable is a little short, but you get the idea. So make sure that the pinching bolt is positioned so that the metal plate is pushing the cable up against the caliper itself, not between the bolt and that plate. And then tighten it down. Don't tighten it down too much yet because you still have to adjust the brakes. Alright, so now we're going to install the front wheel into the fork. You want to make sure you get it correctly oriented with the tread facing forward. The lever on your quick release should always be on the left or non-drive side. And when you're installing your wheel, obviously you want to make sure that it's fully seated in the dropout so that the wheel is centered. So once it is clamped down, what you can do is check the centering in the fork. That looks fairly good. Then what we're going to do is reattach the noodle to the brake caliper. And we can check the distance between our brake pads and the surface of the rim. You can probably tell that the pads are fairly far away from the surface of the rim, but it's a good starting point. So what we're going to do is pull the cable taut so that the brake pads are fully contacting the rim and the wheel can't move at all. So what we want to do is check the orientation of the pads against the surface of the rim. the brake pads should be following the same radius as the brake track on your wheel. So if they aren't, we just want to make a small adjustment to try to get them perfectly aligned with that brake track. If they aren't, they can start to squeal or the pads will wear unevenly. So now you can see that the pad is set up following the radius of the rim perfectly. We're going to make sure that stays that way from front to back. Right, so now that we have the brake pad set up oriented, you just want to release a little bit of the cable until you can start to see the wheel spinning freely. What we're going to do now is try to adjust the center of the brake calipers. You can see one side of the brake might be a little bit closer to the rim than the other. Looks like the left side is a little bit closer. Okay. Beyond just the planar radius position of the brake pads, you also want to make sure that the front is closer than the rear. They call that towing in a brake pad. That stops any kind of squealing from occurring when you hit your brakes. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but the front end of the pad is closer. Okay, so now that we have the brake pads adjusted fairly well, keeping them in orientation with the rim, what you'd like to do is just spin the wheel, make sure that the wheel is fairly true, spinning evenly and straight, and make sure that the pads are not contacting at all. This leads us into centering the brake. As you can see, the right or drive side brake caliper is a little bit closer into the rim than the left side. So the way we adjust this is by making small changes to the amount of tension on the springs on the sides of the brake calipers. That screw, when either turned in or out, will add or release tension from that spring, either pulling or pushing the caliper further in or away from the rim. We'd like it to be fairly centered, so it's good to squeeze the brake pad, check your orientation, and then get a Phillips head screwdriver to check that. So we're going to squeeze the brake pad, and you can see that the left caliper is moving much more than the right, meaning that the spring tension on the left side is much stronger. So what we want to do is add tension to the right caliper by turning that screw clockwise. Just a few turns make a bit of a difference. You can see the pad moving further away from the rim. The spring also flexes a little bit. So what we want to do is just make that small adjustment and then squeeze the brake lever. Check. You can now see that both pads are moving about the same distance. It's still not quite perfect. So make a few small adjustments once again. It looks pretty good. And then after checking the orientation of the brake pads against the rim, you can see it's about even. Again, just give the wheel a spin and make sure that everything seems to be working perfectly without any rubbing going on or noise. A few more tight squeezes just confirm that the calipers are oriented correctly, and you can see from that slight motion in the wheel that the wheel is. Okay, so tighten down your brake cable once everything else is complete. You want to add a pretty good amount of force, but you don't want to pinch the cable to the point where it can't be used again. And then use a cable tip, a small little metal ferrule that you slide over the end of your cable, and a pair of cable cutters. we're going to do is usually about 1.5 to 2 inches of cable at the end of the post. So take your cable tip and your cutters, put the tip over the cable, like so. Use the middle part of the cutter, the crimping tool, to tighten that tip over the cable. Oh, and there it goes. Okay. So use your cable cutter crimping tool to crimp the cable tip over the brake cable. And that'll prevent any kind of fraying or damage from happening to your brake cable, ensuring a nice long life. That is essentially a completed front brake. It always helps at the end to just give it a few tight squeezes and make sure that nothing moves, changes position, everything is how it should be. And there you have a completed front brake. So on the 11-speed, one thing that is different about the brakes is rather than using a Phillips head screwdriver to adjust the spring tension, use a 3mm wrench. It's a slightly nicer brake on the 11-speed. So they use slightly nicer hardware.